All right, everyone. Well, it's 3 minutes past the hour, so I think we should go ahead and get started. My name is Danielle, and I am with Red Rover. I am joined today by my colleague Katia, and we both support the Don't Forget the Pets collaborative project with our teammates at Greater Good Charities. We're joined today by Ross and Sarah from Michelson Found Animals. We are so excited to have them with us today to give their presentation, Mind the Housing Gap, Building Bridges from Just Pet Friendly to Truly Pet Inclusive. And in the interest of making sure we get as much time with them as possible, I'm going to go ahead and hand it away.
Great. Thanks, Danielle. Hi, everyone. It's really nice to be here with all of you today. Thanks to the team at Red Rover and Greater Good for inviting us for this session. Oops, too far. So I'll introduce myself and I'll turn it over to Sarah. My name's Ross Barker. I'm the program director for Michelson Found Animals Pet Inclusive Housing Initiative, or as we call it, PI-HI. The Michelson organization is based in Los Angeles, but our work is at the national level, particularly on this initiative. I've been with Michelson since the program began about 3 years ago. Before joining Michelson, I led research and customer insights teams at Mars Pet Care for more than 10 years. And it's been a great opportunity to bring a similar skill set to this work to give us some important insights. I'm also a pet owner. Currently, I have 2 dogs and 3 cats in our home, and keeps us busy now that all of our kids are no longer in the home. So that's a little about me. And Sarah, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Sarah Maria Muriello. I'm the Senior Program Manager for the Pet Inclusive Housing Initiative, or PI-HI, with Michelson Found Animals. I've been with this team for about a year, a little over a year now. Seems like a wonderful, much longer period than that. Prior to joining Michelson Found Animals, I had been in animal sheltering for about 10 years. I am technically pet free at the moment, although I am now, I would say, a community dog owner, because all of the dogs that run free in my neighborhood tend to gravitate towards my yard for some reason. It could be the treats, I don't know. So I would consider myself a good community pet owner at this point.
Mhm. Great. Thanks, Sarah. I keep going too far. So I want to give a quick word about Michelson Philanthropies, which is the umbrella organization that we're part of. So Michelson Philanthropies was founded by Dr. Gary Michelson. Dr. Michelson's a retired orthopedic surgeon, and he, through some patents and other opportunities, he was able to have some wealth that he wanted to put towards some different missions and programs. And so it's a collection of private nonprofit foundations spanning a range of issues and needs areas. So you can see on the slides of the several different foundations. There's 20 Million Minds, which works toward equity for underserved and historically underrepresented communities, particularly through educational employment opportunities. The Medical Research Fund funds high risk and high potential scientific research. MIIP, which is the Michelson Institute for Intellectual Property, provides access to IP education to support new inventors and entrepreneurs. And then Michelson Center for Public Policy works across this network of foundations to help with legislative change in all of the program areas. Now, specifically, Michelson Found Animals, this is all about bringing people and pets together. This is a program, this is the foundation that we are part of with PI-HI. And so all of the programs within Michelson Found Animals are focused on championing pets at every place where they're intersecting with society. I also want to talk briefly about HABRI, the Human Animal Bond Research Institute, because HABRI is an organization we partnered with to conduct the initial research that led to this program. And we still partner with them on lots of pieces of our initiative. Their work in the Human Animal Bond Research Institute, or Human Animal Bond, has been tremendous, and it helps us really underscore the need for all of the work that we do. So a lot of the work really starts or stems from that insight, the importance of the human-animal bond. Now, specifically, the Pet Inclusive Housing Initiative and what our mission is. You can see it there. We're very interested in making sure that people don't ever have to struggle or don't ever have to make a choice between finding suitable housing and having a pet in their family. We do this through research, which we use to develop resources and partnerships to increase the ability of what we consider truly pet inclusive rental housing. So we'll talk about our term pet inclusive and how that differs from what you may commonly hear of more frequently, which is pet friendly. And just a little bit more context for the program that we're trying to do both now and in the longer term. You can see here, this is something that Sarah and I put together really just to help us ground ourselves and where we're trying to go with this, because we see that there's so much need for when it comes to housing for what we can do from a pet perspective, but we also need to be realistic about what's achievable and in what time frame. And so we start with this very sort of core element of dogs and cats allowed. That's pet friendly, and that's somewhat common to be pet friendly. But we're also really tackling things like basic pet amenities, breeding weight restrictions, and pet related fees. So those are all kind of happening in tandem. Also looking at places where there's breed specific legislation. So whether it's a county or a city, or no states at this point have that, but the counties and cities and some housing authorities have those. And so we want to get to the point where, that's not a barrier. We also want to ultimately see how the definition of a pet in terms of housing can expand to other animals that are companion animals. So whether it's rabbits or snakes, whatever those are, that those are part of it too. But the big one for us is this outer orange ring, right? This pets or family, because that's what we're really trying to strive for in the end. Because if globally, universally, we're thinking about pets as family, then a lot of the issues we're talking about in terms of fees and restrictions just fall by the wayside, the same way that they do when you try to rent a place and you've got a family with children, right? So we're trying to get to that point where pets are so much considered part of the family, it's not even a consideration whether they should be allowed in the housing. So for today, a few objectives we want to lay out and we hope to connect on with you. So the first one is we want to articulate and make it really clear the difference between pet friendly and pet inclusive and how that gap shows up, how that, that dichotomy and the gap shows up in the rental housing market. We want y'all to be able to gain a deeper understanding of market rate housing issues and how to advocate for pet inclusive housing with the people you work with in your communities. And then we're going to spend the bulk of the time talking about pet inclusive housing resources for initiating programs and discussions that can engage housing operators in these in these opportunities and how you can drive them forward in your own communities. And we're really trying to focus this on mutual benefit for everyone, right? We're not, we work closely with the housing providers as well as the animal welfare organizations and with pet owners. And we see an opportunity for all these groups to benefit from the greater access to housing for people with pets. So much of what we'll discuss today relates to pet inclusivity, both during and after co-sheltering situations. So there's some resources that apply to both situations, some that are a little more relevant in particular, one or the other. But in general, it's the same idea, right? We're trying to make sure that whether it's a temporary housing situation or as we move into permanent, that these barriers and prohibitive fees don't get in the way of that. So a quick poll, and we have a couple polls today. So this is the first one. In one word, what do you think is the biggest barrier to keeping people and pets together in co-sheltering environments? So if you just go up to if you just use that QR code, that'll take you to a spot to put in a word. You can also go to slido.com and join it there. So let's give about a minute to do that.
And those of you using the Slido, that's great. If you're unable to, we're seeing your answers also coming up in the chat, which is great.
That's
We
great.
have liability, fear, lack of knowledge, inclusivity. So we've got lots of great
About
answers.
15 more seconds and then yeah, that's great. If you just put in the chat, that's fine too, for sure.
Yeah, that's great.
All right, let's go to the big reveal. Okay. So we see liability and fear come up. So we'll definitely talk about, we'll get into some resources to help with those issues, those challenges. And then when we get to the Q&A session, it might be nice for people that, if you have particular concerns, I'd love to, we always like to understand as much as we can about these concerns. And so maybe we can, if there's time, we can dig in a little bit to what you're thinking about when it comes to liability and fear. But we can do that as we go on. So yeah, good. So these are great. I mean, these is and very similar to what we see when we talk to groups who are working in the community. Yeah, you won't be surprised to hear that this looks very different when we have housing providers on the call. We ask the same basic question, what their concerns are, and we see very different results, which is good for us because it makes us keeps us in that middle ground of how do we bring these pieces together. Yeah, I see somebody says lack of knowledge, so they must have had a sneak peek at the some of the slides coming up. So, all right, so let's go on. So I want to start with this basic idea. We think this is a challenge that's fundamental to the discussion, to the challenge we're facing when it comes to pet inclusive housing. And that is just that this term pet friendly is not well defined. So from our research, we know that 76%, so 3/4 of owner operators or housing providers consider themselves to be pet friendly. Sounds pretty good, right? I mean, if you consider that 2/3 of households in the US, roughly 2/3 of households in the US have a pet, that 76% says, okay, well, that should mostly take care of our pets, right? But here's the thing, right? If you factor in policies where cats are okay, but not dogs, policies where dogs are okay, but not cats, there's breed restrictions, there are size restrictions, there are limitations on the number of pets, there's non-refundable fees, monthly pet rents, no pet amenities, and just a generally non-welcoming environment, which you kind of add all this stuff up. It's not a surprise, probably, that 72% of residents say that pet-friendly housing is hard to find. And in the end, only 8% of rental housing is free of all pet restrictions. So this is that disconnect we talk about when we say pet-friendly is not the same thing as pet inclusive, and we need to be thinking about them differently. Otherwise, we're not talking about the same problem. And one group thinks it's solved, and our group thinks there's a lot of work to do. So here's what we've spent quite a bit of time in the past year in particular, really based on the knowledge we've gained over 3 years and data that we have, trying to define, put together a pretty simple definition of what this looks like, right? So pet friendly, we think of as just housing that allows residents to have at least one pet, regardless of other restrictions. And when we talk about pet inclusive, we're going beyond that. So again, different term. So I want to stress that we're not substituting one thing for another, where it's not a synonym. It's not just we like this term better. We're thinking about something really, really different here. And this is a definition that would include no breed restrictions, no weight restrictions, no unreasonable or prohibitive fees, and just basic pet amenities. So here talking about things like enough weigh stations and enough space for exercise relief area for dogs, those kinds of things, right? It doesn't have to be the fancy grooming stations, agility equipment, and those sorts of things. It's just the basics that we're talking about here. So what we see here is pet friendly is a start, but that's all it is just a start. The graphic on the right just puts us, it's the same basic idea in a more colorful way. To get to that chart, you can use this QR code to go grab that chart if you want to. It's also really easy to access on our website. So it's not like this is your only chance to do this, but this is, if you want to be looking at that as we go through this, you can grab that there. Okay, so why aren't more pets allowed in rental housing and transitional housing? And I think somebody hit on this in the chat. Lack of recognition that there's a problem, right? That don't realize what's, think they have it solved. And so this is something we hear from housing providers when we've talked to them in the past. They'll say, oh, no, we've solved, with the exact words, right? We've solved the pet problem, right? Because in their minds, that 76% pet friendly number is what's in their head right there. So we're trying to get them to think about, okay, but there's that 72% that still say pet friendly housing is hard to find. So what are you doing about those folks? So just not recognizing that there's a problem is a big component of this. And before I go on to some of the data we have. I want to just talk about where we get some of this data because it's not easily accessible and it's something that we're not seeing a lot of other places be able to produce. So it's very helpful to us. And so we subscribe to a data set called Smart Apartment Data. In that database, there's more than 200,000 properties across, that include more than 20 million units that we can look at. We can look at their pet policies, we can look at the fees, and begin to get an understanding of, okay, what's pet friendly, how many are pet friendly, how many are pet inclusive. So when we look at that, so we can kind of look at this, give you a second to orient yourself to this, but this is essentially in 10 markets plus a national view of 10 markets that we're looking at most closely, just to give us a span of different geographies and demographics. We look at these 10 cities: Atlanta, Charlotte, Chicago, Denver, Houston, Los Angeles, Orlando, Philadelphia, Portland, and DC. And what you see here are the percentage of, in this case, just properties that allow pets. So nationally, we can see it's about 80% that allow pets. So that's close to that pet friendly number, right? You can see that most of them hover in that 80+%. Los Angeles is very low, but we think there's reasons for that from a just type of property perspective. But you see these numbers are pretty good. Again, if we figure that 2/3 of households have a pet, these numbers would be pretty accommodating for that. But the problem is, as we saw with that definition, when you strip out the companies that have breed and size restrictions, the properties that have breed and size restrictions, you see these numbers plummet, right? So nothing, only Philly is above 10%, but everything is, generally between 5 and 7% is what we're seeing. So this is the challenge, right? When people are looking for a place with a pet, unless it fits that very particular type of pet, within a certain size and and it's a certain breed, it's not going to be at all easy to find a place to rent with that pet. Yeah. So, there's some concerns that are consistently raised by housing providers when we talk to them. Some of those are the ones that you pointed out in the earlier poll question. The ones that we hear really frequently are around damages. We hear about insurance and liability, which translate to the risk issue. We hear about waste, right? That's a big one. We hear about other renters or other, whether they're also pet owners or non-pet owning renters, but other renters in that community and what their thoughts are. We also hear that there's not really a benefit to a housing provider for allowing more pets. Why should they do it? And then the last one is just this unknown, right? They not just like, they'll say, I don't know what's going to go wrong. I just think something is going to go wrong or something could go wrong. I don't want to take the chance. So again, it gets back a little bit to the risk issue. So what can be done? First to say, this is where we're going to get into the resources. So really give you the opportunity and share some resources you can engage with to begin to have these conversations. And so I'm going to turn it over to Sarah to talk about some of these to get us started. Sarah?
Yeah, thanks, Ross. So, one of the things that Pi High has focused on a lot this year is creating resources, not just for pet owners and animal welfare orgs, but also for providers of housing of all types. And so for the next few slides, I'm going to be talking about our resources that we feel are really applicable to all of you and to really anyone in the housing space, co-sheltering space, when it comes to people with pets living in those communities. Ross, if you can go to the next slide. So the foundational resource at the core of the next few slides is making the case for pet inclusive policies, because of course, whenever we're engaging housing providers of any kind with conversations around dropping breed and weight restrictions, there are a lot of questions and a lot of very reasonable questions and understandable concerns. And some of these questions may resonate with you when you're thinking about bringing a pet into a housing housing situation, right? So, don't breed restrictions prevent dangerous pets from living on the property? How will we keep residents and their pets safe without these restrictions? And won't allowing, all these breeds affect our liability insurance? So these are questions we hear, and we understand them. But we also, as Ross mentioned, don't feel that these concerns are insurmountable. So we've pulled out a lot of these questions and actually created individual resources around them to help better address these concerns. Ross, if you can go to the next slide. So one of the core resources around all of these questions around safety and liability is our breed does not equal behavior resource. There was a study published in 2022 in Science, not our study, but a really great study that established that breed is not a reliable indicator of behavior, that there is 0% correlation between pet dog genetics and threatening or biting behavior, and that idea of a dog's breed mix through appearance is often inaccurate with a 75% mistake rate. So what this all means is that even if we're able to establish a dog's breed, and again, we're all terrible at doing that just visually, but let's say we use a DNA test, for example, to establish a dog's breed. Even when we know that, it is still not going to be a reliable indicator of behavior, and it's certainly not going to tell us whether that animal will display threatening or biting behavior. And what all of this demonstrates is that problematic stereotypes are the foundation of these arbitrary breed restrictions. And that's because breed has limited influence on behavior. And ultimately, where we need to be is in a place where we are assessing and evaluating dogs based on their individual behavior, right, rather than on their breed. Right now, breed restrictions provide a very false sense of safety and security for housing communities. And so we need to lean into the science to help allay some of those fears. Next slide, Ross. And one of the tools that we can use to help us sort of move beyond this fear and get to know pets as individuals is through a tool like the Pet Personality Profile. We offer this tool on our website, just a free downloadable form. And what it does, it empowers the housing provider to collect holistic information about an individual pet's behavior. In addition to some basic health status questions about the pet, it helps housing providers understand that dog's behavior around people and importantly, around other dogs. And so again, moving beyond these arbitrary breed restrictions that really across the board eliminate so many amazing pets, right, from belonging in a housing community, moving beyond that into a space where we are empowered to evaluate animals as individuals, just as we do with people, right? Or should do with people, and being able to welcome them into our housing communities in a way that brings a lot of benefit to the pet and to the person and empowers the housing provider. Next slide, please, Ross. Another tool that could be used, and we highly recommend this in any housing situation where pets are involved, is that the housing provider have a pet agreement in place. We offer a sample pet agreement. It's downloadable and completely editable from our website. And the great benefit of having an agreement in place is that it helps establish clear community expectations from the get-go, so that if something were to happen, and we're not saying it will, but if something were to happen, you have some recourse as a housing provider. You could say, look, you signed this agreement that your pet would be on leash at all times in community spaces. This is the third time we've seen your dog off leash, and we need to have a conversation, right, about some consequences here. So again, utilizing some empowering tools that provide holistic information and reasonable expectations are a lot more powerful and effective than these arbitrary breed restrictions. And finally, Ross, on the next resource, we do get a lot of questions around insurance and property liability coverage. We are aware that there are a number of insurance companies out there that do have breed restrictions in their underwriting, but it's certainly not all of them. So if you're if you have a breed restriction in place in any housing environment due to an understanding that it's an insurance issue, we would just challenge you to maybe dig a little more deeply on the matter. So our tip sheet will help you identify your company or organization's insurance provider, because that can be a challenge in and of itself, is just finding out who's issuing the policy. And then more importantly, finding out if it's truly a restriction in the insurance policy or if it's simply a guideline. Oftentimes, insurance companies will issue guidelines around breed, but it's not an actual restriction in the underwriting. And finally, if you do find out that it's a true restriction, that there is a breed restriction in the policy, um, our tip sheet will help you navigate some dialogue with your insurance provider around that issue, um, because really insurance companies should be providing data that backs up their decisions in their policies. And what our experience is showing is that oftentimes insurance companies are unable to provide the data that support these breed restrictions. So it's really important that you ask for that data and that you challenge them on that matter if a restriction actually exists in the policy and it's not just a guideline. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ross. If you want to go to the next slide, he's going to talk a little bit more about resources for permanent housing, and I'll be keeping an eye on the chat and putting in some links to these resources as we go along.
That's great. Thank you, Sarah. So one thing I want to point out about all of these resources is that what you're seeing in most cases is just a super high level summary of what's in that resource, right? So when you go to the website and actually pull the resource, you'll see a much more fleshed out so talking points, those sorts of things to really specifically drive a conversation, right? So just be aware of that. So, and as Sarah said, I mean, ultimately, this permanent housing issue is really critical. I mean, we all hope that people are going to find a path to suitable permanent housing. And so just wanted to mention a few resources we've developed that are a little more specific to that, although a lot of these things are hard to categorize, right? You can put them, lots of people can use these resources depending on what their situation is, but these ones are a little more specific to permanent housing, I think. So the first one is just basic idea of how do we talk to housing providers about their pet policies, right? And how what do we want to communicate to them about why they should be allowing pets, right? So it's important to go into it trying to really learn and understand their issues. I mean, that we found that goes a long way. If we go asking questions about their policies rather than telling them why their policies are wrong, then we find a better conversation goes from that. Speak their language, right? We have really gone away from the landlord language as an example, right? We don't call them landlords. That has a lot of connotations that are negative. That's why we've tried several different types of language around this that are sort of all encompassing, but we've sort of landed on housing providers to cover both owners and operators of housing. And it's just an easier way to think about this. On the flip side, housing providers don't like to call their renters tenants, right? Because that tenant, same thing this tenant landlord relationship has a history of being antagonistic in some sense. And so if we can change that dynamic just through some words, right, then I think that's worth trying to do that. So they refer to the people they rent to as either renters or their residents, which also underscores that they really are there to provide something of value to people. That's important to them. Also go and try and understand the business focus, right? Get our messages across about pets, but really trying to understand what their concerns are from a business perspective. Because in the end, they are business people, right? Who are trying to make these decisions from that perspective. We try to go away from putting blame. I mean, certainly we can all say, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things we know that landlords and property owners and providers should do differently. But we can avoid playing this game of it's your fault and this is why housing is the problem it is. I think we'll go further and also encourage baby steps and encourage them to take baby steps and we take baby steps so that it's not thinking we have to do all at once or nothing. So one other thing another resource out there, this is a whole deck that we put together that is aimed at property owners and I'll use the term landlord just because that's where people are thinking about it, but that need to be persuaded down this path of pet inclusivity. So it's going to summarize a lot of the points we talked about in this presentation, and but it's in I think it's 14 or 15 slides that are pretty simple to walk through and have nice pictures of dogs and cats with families. And so encourage you to use that. Or that's something we can also walk through with you to kind of help you think through how would you share this with a housing provider. Part of our work relates to just tackling misconceptions that are out there. So this resource is going to do that. It's going to help point out and counter some of the misconceptions that many people have when it comes to pets and housing. For example, we'll just go through some of these. So, we talk about pet friendly, not meaning all pets are welcome. So let's make that, get that point across. That's an important one. Point out that pets are not the most costly source of damages. Young adults and families with young children cause more damage in rental units than people with pets do. I mean, that's in our research. And so it's just a false claim to kind of say, well, if I let pets in, it's going to cause more damage. You're not going to be any worse off than some of the other groups that are in anyway. In truth, what we found is that less than 10% of pets cause any kind of damage. And when they do cause damage, the average pet damages average damages from that pet are only about $210. And so that number is important because it's well below most refundable security deposits. So if the point of charging heavy fees is to cover the cost of a pet being there and damages that are expected, our response to that is, but that's what a security deposit is for. I mean, and if it's being covered within that security deposit, then what are you trying to, what are you accomplishing? What are you adding to the pet experience by having that additional money come through? Similarly, we have some what we just called myth busting statistics. So the same kind of thing. This provides facts to challenge what people think they know, right? So when it comes to safety and dog bites and aggression of dogs, Sarah mentioned the breed not being, that's a big one, the breed not being an indicator of behavior, particularly aggression in dogs. So concerns about damage, I talked about that a little bit. If we have those stats at our fingertips, it's a lot easier to have the conversation. Concerns about resident perceptions. I mean, there's a study that we didn't do, National Multifamily Housing Council did this, where they found that only 6% of residents said they would only live someplace that did not allow pets. So that means that 94%, the vast majority of renters are fine with pets being in the building, even if they don't have a pet. And so I think, and that's important because one of the things that we will hear from housing providers is that, well, I've got these residents, they've been there for a long time and they might not want pets. What's that going to do? It's like, well, I mean, did you ask them? Because they might not care at all, right? And our intent is not to make every single rental unit accessible to pets. There's always going to be some that don't allow pets. We just want to make sure that nobody with a pet can't find housing. That's the objective. They have concerns about the bottom line financially. So we have data to talk about resident retention in particular being a benefit in terms of their financial situation because pet owners stay longer than non-pet owners. And so there's less cost to them in terms of the turnover cost of getting a unit ready for a new person or a new tenant renter. So there's things that we can talk about to mitigate those challenges. And then this is an important one that, this covers some of the why behind why we think it's important, why it's important for housing providers to eliminate their restrictions. We go through, this back to this 2/3 of households own a pet. So if you are ignoring that fact, you're going to find yourself with a limited market, right? So that's an important consideration for the housing providers as business people, right? Also, if we talk about how Gen Z and millennials, who are increasingly the biggest market of renters, biggest segment of the renter market, they're also the biggest acquirer of pets at this point, right? And so if they're looking at those trends and trying to understand how their financial picture is going to look even a couple of years down the road, then it's an important consideration, right? One thing we also talk about is the ESA requests. There's a lot of concern about ESA requests among housing providers. They feel like they're getting a lot of what they would call fraudulent ESA requests. People don't need them. They're just trying to get around a pet restriction or a fee. And our response to that is like, so don't have these policies, don't have these restrictions, and people won't have to do that, right? You only see requests for ESAs when it's when it's really needed, right? And then you also want to have unreported pets. Another concern is pets that people sneak in because they don't want to. There's no pet policy. They figure, oh, I'll just sneak it in. If the housing provider sees it, then we'll just say, well, it's a friend's. And so this happens a lot. But it's a frustrating experience for everybody. So if we can increase the transparency around this and make the responsibility a joint one between the property managers and the renters, then it's going to just be a stronger approach. And we also, keeping families together. I mean, these are the less tangible things, but also equally important. Keeping families together, building stronger communities. We also have seen research, good academic research that talks about crime being less prevalent in communities or neighborhoods where pets are present. And it's mostly because it gets people out and they know each other. And so there's a familiarity, and more trust and less suspicion about people. And so it does a lot of good in the intangible way. What's also important about this resource is the flip side of the document is talks about how to do it, right? Just simple steps, actionable steps they can take for getting started. So Sarah talked about the expectations, having a pet policy, tools to manage pets on site, look at the amenities you have. Are they really the right ones for the community that you have? Partner marketing opportunities. And a lot of you working in, if you're in a shelter or rescue, there might be opportunities to partner with housing communities to do events, adoption events, fostering events. We've seen those be very effective. And then I think the last one I'm going to show is really just to remind, we're not lawyers, right? So we're not, but what we do want to make sure is that people understand that there's with the Fair Housing Act, there are very specific things that come out of that in terms of people's rights with rental housing in general, but including for people with pets. And so it's important to have this resource for people that are not sure kind of what their rights are. We can also point people to organizations that are much more, this is their thing. I mean, in Los Angeles, Heart LA is a great example of one that this is what they really focus on. So we're just trying to help spread that same word that you have rights and you should understand what they are. Also for the housing providers to understand, look, you're maybe not fully aware of the Fair Housing Act, and you probably should be. So this is our second and final poll for today. So we've shown you a lot of resources. And so, but thinking about what Sarah and I have shared, now that you know that these resources exist, how likely are you or someone in your organization to use or share one or more of them? So just a multiple choice, you could just tell us what you think. Very likely, somewhat unlikely, or very unlikely. And you can also, as we did earlier, put it in the chat and we can tally them up that way. Looks like a lot of people are doing that. That's great. Take another 20 seconds.
Thanks, Bree. Bree says she already has. That's great.
It's great if we can add that as an option. So, all right, let's see what we have on the Slido. Very likely, somewhat likely. Okay, this is great. This is helpful for us to see. I mean, it's great to see that the majority are likely to do this. And I would also say we're super easy to access and to reach. And so if you have ideas, I mean, so if any of these resources look interesting to you, but you're not seeing exactly what you wanted, to go to the website, take a look, or ask us, because we're constantly developing new resources where we want to put stuff out there that's going to be useful and also not duplicating other organizations and the work they're doing, because there's a lot of great work around pets and housing happening in the animal welfare space. We're not trying to duplicate that work. We're trying to add to it. So let us know if there's something you think you would like to see. Last thing to go through, just how do you, how can you learn more? How do we stay in touch? We have a newsletter, a monthly newsletter. You can either go to our website and sign up for that, or you can go to LinkedIn sign up there. You can sign up for it there. It's the same newsletter, same content, but every month we'll have, typically have a blog by Judy Bellack. She's our multifamily industry principal. So she's always big on a topic that's related to kind of trying to change the hearts and minds of the housing providers, but it's also always got some relevant pieces in there to other people thinking about this issue. Links to stories, but they might not even be necessarily pet focused, but they are housing focused. So trying to get everybody thinking about housing in general. And the pet piece of this is just one component of the big housing issue that's out there. But the newsletter helps to keep up to date with all those things. You can also follow Pi High on LinkedIn. We've got a dedicated LinkedIn page. We post frequently, several times a week, and we put out new data points that we found as we're digging through the data. Oh, this is interesting. Let's put this out there for people to see. If we find an article that's relevant, we're always scouring the internet for new articles that are interesting and relevant for us. And so we'll post those. So we're really trying to keep a conversation going. So really encourage you to, follow us there, but also reach out to us with questions or ideas. And you can find us at petsandhousing.org. And that's all we have. But I think Sarah and I would love to take questions.
I've been keeping track. Just so everyone knows, I've put 3 different email addresses into the chat in case you have specific questions or you're interested in data that applies to your community. Ross, around that issue of data, there was a question that I answered in the chat about access. Basically a free or low cost subscription to Smart. Unfortunately, the multifamily industry holds their data pretty tightly, and it's very expensive to purchase. But again, that's why I put our emails in the chat. If you're interested in pulling, interested in data related to your community, feel free to reach out to us. But Ross, one of the questions was, do you know if Smart apartment data is available for Canada? I don't actually know the answer.
I don't think so. I mean, there might be some, there probably is something similar that's out there. There's a couple of products in the US. There may be something that covers Canada, not Smart. But just to piggyback on what Sarah said, we frequently, they'll see that chart that we showed with the pet friendly versus pet inclusive and say, oh, can you do this for Kansas City, right? And we can pull that together for Kansas City and kind of look at it and compare it to others, similar types of markets. So we can definitely help with that. So if you've got something, if you have a meeting coming up or you're trying to make the case that it's really bad in this particular area, let us know. We can put that together. Sarah's become super fast at that. So
one of the questions we had, Ross, when we had the word cloud come up, was, what are the results when we do this word cloud with housing providers or property owners? What are we hearing from them as their top concerns?
Damage and damages, because the words show up differently, but those are always the 2 biggest, right? Liability comes up, so damages comes up a lot, and so we're finding ourselves having to really dig into this damage number, because we showed you the 9% of pets cause damage. We showed you the $210 when it is. We also know that in the cases where the pet causes damage over the security deposit amount, that the pet owners almost always pay out of pocket for it. So we know that's all true. And when we talk about that with housing providers, they usually have an experience or 2 that totally goes against that, right? And we say, look, but yes, you're gonna, every housing provider, if you're in business long enough, you're gonna have a situation where the cat destroyed all the carpeting from urinating, right? You're gonna have a situation where the dog chewed up the molding. You're gonna have these things are going to happen. We're looking at the averages, we're looking at the overall, and just because those things are going to get covered a different way, right? And so you putting them in the same bucket doesn't really make sense. And so we're trying to look at what are the data really look like. Having said that, we need to go back and revisit that data to be sure that we're super, super solid on it. So
great. Another question that we had was, do we have a list of insurers that do and do not have grade restrictions?
We have so when it comes to pets and housing, there's 2 types of insurance that we're concerned about. One is renter's insurance, because a lot of housing providers require renter's insurance. It's actually, in this case, we think it's a good idea. It's a cost, but it's a good idea because what it allows them to do is to put an additional pet addendum on there. So that's one thing in insurance in general. We do know that there's a handful of, a lot of insurance companies do not even ask about breed when they're writing renters insurance or homeowners insurance policies. Some big ones fall on that list, including State Farm. So there are a lot that don't do it. And we do have a list of those on our website when it comes to renters insurance, right? So you can find those. I don't know what do you have under 6 maybe companies or something like
there's
that.
6 or 7. I put them in. I put the resource.
Okay, so you'd be able to, if you're talking to somebody and say, well, I'm trying to get renter's insurance, but all the renters say I can't, they're not going to give me a renter's insurance policy because I have a pity. You can find a company that will do that. The more challenging one is the second piece of insurance, which is the kind of commercial liability insurance, or the what's also thought of as landlord insurance. It's just hard to get that information, right? We're trying, so that actually is a piece of research that we're trying to do in coordination with some other animal welfare groups over the next few months to try to understand better what's going on there. There's also, relevant to this question, quite a bit of legislation that's being proposed in different states that would, the intent is to make it so that insurance companies cannot add, they basically can't factor breed and size into their, either whether they give a policy or not, or what they charge for the policy. So I would say that that's something that's happening. So we also talk about that with the house providers. Like, look, the insurance, it's gonna change, right? I mean, there's enough of a wave going against those restrictions in insurance that it's going to change. And so, like, don't you want to be ahead of it rather than behind it, is what we try to say.
Yeah.
So
on that note, Ross, around in insurance, are you aware of any insurers who had breed restrictions but who were persuaded to remove them?
No, I'm not specifically. That is a really good question, though. So I would like to look into that. We'll talk to some people that might know that. Yeah, I do. That's a good question.
Yeah.
And that kind of question is good for us, is then we can think, okay, well, maybe what you're thinking as well, whoever asked the question, is then, like, how do we do that? How do we replicate that, right? How do we take that same conversation to other providers?
Right. The next question is around the damage data you cited.
Yeah.
The question is the damage data from the fire paw study, or is there a more recent study?
Yeah, I don't think we even specifically talked about our report. So the thing that I mentioned when I talked about HABRI, the foundational piece of this program was the Pet Inclusive Housing report that we published in 2021. And so that's where our damage information is coming from. That Firepaw is a study from 2005. The world has changed a lot since 2005. And so I think at the time it was groundbreaking. I would ask people to look at our research as a more recent look at the pet industry. I mean, 20 years ago, that pet friendly number really would have been much, much lower. I mean, Judy Belloc, I've talked about her, our industry principal. I mean, she was, she was in multifamily 20 years ago. She's like, I mean, pets were they were just not a thing, right, to bring into housing. So it's really changed. I mean, but our data also is published in 2021. So even that's getting outdated now. So we need to update that. And that's, that damages number is really important. So I think that Firepaw quotes like $1,500 in damages. And it's just not what we're seeing. So,
Danielle, just want to make sure, are we okay on time?
Absolutely. You are doing great on time.
Thanks. So we had 2 more questions, Ross, from the chat. People sometimes say they are allergic to dogs or cats. Do you have any evidence on true rates of pet allergies?
No, we don't. Wish we did, because that comes up frequently. But when that comes up is when people, honestly, I think that in our conversations that tends to come up when people are just throwing stuff up at the wall to see what's going to stick, right? And it's not to discount people that really do have allergies and that are, that really can't be in a place where a cat has lived. But I think that this is where getting to know the pets, getting to know the people that are living in your properties, and having thought through what your property is going to look like with pets makes a difference, right? Because if you've got somebody that really has these allergies and somebody's moving in with cats, place them further away from the person that has the allergies, right? And cats and you can have rules about community spaces if you need to do that. But it's not. We hear from housing providers. We hardly ever hear it from. In fact, I can't think of a time where I've heard of it from a renter or a prospective renter or a services agency that's working with the renters. Again, not to say it doesn't happen. I just think there's ways around it, right? And because I guess to your original question, I think that the incidence is pretty low of people that are like, I can't live in a place. I'm gonna have to go to the hospital if I live in a place around cats or dogs, right?
We had another question in the chat, and I'll preface this by saying I don't think we have the answer to it, right? The question is there not enough housing for abused women who have children and pets in LA? Because our data and our work is around more like traditional rental housing. But Ross, do you want to take a moment just to talk a little bit about the unique landscape of LA, just really quickly, and why it might look different in any type of housing from other places in the country?
Yeah, I mean, you saw that number of 67% being just pet friendly in Los Angeles, yeah. And a lot of it has to do with the housing stock in California and what it looks like. It's composed of many more small, independently owned and operated rental units, as opposed to a place like Orlando or Atlanta or Houston, where there's just a lot of very large Class A properties that have 250, 500, 1,000 units to them, right? So those are much easier to put pet-friendly policies into. So that's very different. It also means those independent owners and operators are concerned about. I mean, they don't have a lot of properties to spread their risk across, right? So they may be more concerned. It may be tougher to move on their policies, but they may also have more to gain from allowing pets in if they see the benefits. So we're talking about that. On the sheltering piece, though, I mean, it varies a lot by I think it varies by market, but also varies by depending on who you talk to, right? Because there are organizations, I'm sure people, I mean, Red Rover does, I mean, this is a focus for you, and other organizations in the industry that this is what they're trying to do, is make sure that people that are coming out of domestic violence situations or homeless situations have a place to go with their pet without having to sacrifice their pet. And I don't think I mean, I guess the way I think about it is these organizations would not all exist if it wasn't a real issue, right? So I do think it's a real issue. And funding was approved, and I think they're trying to have it reapproved, but there was funding in the PALS Act several years ago. Was it the PALS Act where they were, it approved funding of granting funds to organizations to allow them to kind of retrofit facilities because part of the challenge is like, if you just say we're going to build new facilities that allow pets, how are you going to do it? How are you going to pay for it? And there was federal funding that was made available for that. So I mean, it's past some of those bars, enough of those bars to make it clear that that's a real issue. As Sarah said, that we're focused on the permanent housing piece of this, but we think they're linked, right? Because it doesn't matter. I mean, if people don't have a permanent housing situation to go to, the benefit of the co-sheltering with pets only gets them so far.
Yeah.
Right.
Ross, we've got one final question. I think we've got just a couple minutes to answer. Have you had any luck working with apartment associations or professional landlord associations to increase pet inclusivity? That's
the big question. Yeah, we have. It takes so many discussions to make this happen. And but yes, we've had some of this. We've had a lot of conversations. We've had that have led to changes. We have some case studies published that will that talk about those. I can give you a couple examples that aren't in case studies. Company called Paradigm. They manage, I think, 5 properties, and they had a conversation with us at a conference, and their marketing person, I mean, nice because Judy knows lots of people. She knew this person, and she said, "What about your pet policies?" She said, "Oh, that's such a great idea." She went back, and like 6 months later, she wrote back to Judy and said, "We are going completely pet no breed, no size restrictions as of next week. Here's our whole campaign around that. So that's an example. We did a webinar several weeks ago for the East Bay Rental Housing Association. And then I was in Oakland last week to talk about, we had a table and kind of talking about this. And a guy came up to me and he said, hey, he said, didn't you do a webinar a couple of weeks ago? And I said, yeah. And we were talking about pets and housing, right? And it's the same thing we're talking about here. And he said, that was so great. He said, after that, I went out immediately and I changed my policies in he's only got a few properties, but he went out and changed his policies in those properties. So, I mean, so those are small things, but they also talk to other people, right? And that helps us spread the message. So there is success. It's slow, but we're marking the change, and we're really confident that it's going to keep going. And real quick, I see there's one, resources working with local governments. I would say reach out to us and know specifically what you're working on, what you're trying to do, because we've started to develop those. We're having conversations with example, we had a conversation with around a piece of legislation in Evanston, Illinois, that's they're trying to move forward, and talked to the animal services team yesterday about what kind of position they should take on it. So we're kind of talking with them. So we do have ideas and resources. We just haven't completely fleshed them all out yet. And on all these questions, I really want to say, underscore that we don't have all the answers on these things, right? And so we may sometimes talk like we do, we don't. And so the questions that you ask and you feel like, oh, I know something that you don't know, please let us know, right? I mean, if you have access, I think I saw somebody refer to some research when the allergy discussion was happening. So if there's something, because we love to take that stuff in and just make it part of what we're packaging up here. So please reach out to us.
Okay.
Wonderful. Sarah, are there any more questions in the chat, or are we
No,
at the end of that? Awesome.
I think we're good.
Wonderful. Well, yeah, I will do one last call, everyone. Please, if you would like to receive the follow-up email for today's presentation with a link to the slide deck and the recording, please do send me your name and email address in a private message, including your last name, so that we can mark you as attended, or just ensure that your display name in Zoom matches the name that you registered with. One final thing I will share around the topic of sort of pet-friendly sheltering, specifically domestic violence sheltering. Ross is absolutely right. The Office for Victims of Crime has had a fantastic grant opportunity for the last several years that is available. I believe last year's awards, or really this year's awards, were up to $500,000 to retrofit domestic violence shelters and temporary housing facilities for DV survivors to be pet friendly. Red Rover, we also offer our Safe Housing Grant, which awards up to $60,000 in funding. That grant is open 3 times per year. And again, in domestic violence shelters who are wanting to become pet friendly are absolutely eligible for that funding. If you are curious about more data on pet friendly domestic violence shelters in your area, I do encourage you to check out domesticshelters.org. We partner with them pretty closely to track our data. That's how we know that about 19% of domestic violence shelters right now across the country are pet friendly. But of course, that number can be very different based on where you're actually located. But they have a great search tool on their website where you can enter your zip code, and it will populate a list of domestic violence shelters near you, and it will indicate whether or not that shelter has pet options. And you just give it a click and you can see if those pet options are on-site sheltering or off-site sheltering. So just want to make sure that resource is available to you all.
That's great.
Wonderful. Well, another huge thank you to Ross and to Sarah for joining us today. This was just such a fantastic presentation with so many wonderful resources. You can definitely mark me as a yes, absolutely. I will be sharing these resources.
Excellent. Always good to hear.
Today.
So, yeah, thank you so much for attending, everybody, and thank you, Danielle, for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your day.
You too. Take care. Bye.
Bye.